Okay, so this will be, I think the last video, well, no, yeah, the last video in chapter 11, um, but we have one more section in chapter 13, right? And I think then we'll be done. Um, so, okay, so I think I mentioned in the previous video that why would you ever need to complete the square when you know the quadratic formula? Right. Well, suppose you don't know the quadratic formula, right? If you don't know it yet, again, spend some time trying to learn it, memorize it, sing it, however you want to remember it. You got to remember it, okay? There's no way around that. But then my question to you is, well, where did that come from, right? So where did that quadratic formula come from, right? Right? Why is it negative b? Why not positive b? Why is it, b squared minus 4ac and not something else, right? So I'm going to answer that question, and you might, I mean, if you have that question, then by all means, let's get through this, right? Let's figure out the quadratic formula. And the way we do it is we're going to complete the square, right? We're going to solve for x by completing the square on this equation here. And you might think, wait a minute, then okay, but what's a, b, and c? You have to give me a specific example. Well, I'm not. We're going to leave this equation as it is. A, b, and c are numbers. They represent numbers, right? They represent numbers. We just don't know what they are, so we have to leave them as a, b, and c. Okay? So yeah, let's go through the process of completing the square, right? So step one is to write this in standard form, and of course it's already in standard form. That's given to us in standard form. Okay, not hard, right? Step two, also not hard. Divide both sides by a. Now we don't know if a is 1 or not. If a is 1, then we can leave it. In fact, then we shouldn't write the a here. Oops, sorry. And we shouldn't write the a. Hang on. I erased my 2 here. All right, so step 2 is to divide by a. So both sides. All of this divided by a, and 0 divided by a. Well, 0 divided by a is still 0, right? So that doesn't change that. However, on the left, we have to split this up. We're going to do ax squared divided by a plus bx divided by a plus c divided by a. And that's still equal to, right, 0. Right? Okay. Now, a divided by a is 1. So we can cancel the a's, right, because we're assuming a is not 0, of course. That's a condition here. Otherwise, it's not quadratic. So we end up with x squared plus, so this is b over a times x, right, plus c over a times 1 equals 0. Okay, so that's step 2. On to step 3. Remember what step 3 is. Take this number, the thing without the x, that's the c over a, and just subtract it from both sides. So minus c over a on the left, minus c over a on the right. And so that becomes x squared plus, we have b over a times x plus 0, right, equals negative c over a. Okay, so that was step 3. That's supposed to be a 3 here. Okay, good enough. All right, remember what step 4 is. Step 4 is, well, to take the number in front of the x, and in this case, that's b over a. Okay, so we take the number in front of the x, the b over a, and we do 2 things to it, right? We divide it by 2, which is the same thing as cutting it in half, so multiply by 1/2, right? So we get b over 2a. And then you have to square it. Yep, the whole thing. So we square the numerator, and we square the 2, and we square the a. Square everything. So you get b squared on top, divided by 4a squared on the bottom. Okay, so what do we do with this number? Remember, a, b, and c are just numbers, so what do we do with this number? In step 5, we add that to both sides, right? So we have to add b squared over 4a squared to the left, and so we have to add, b squared over 4a squared on the right. Yep, I know this is not obvious. This is pretty tricky here, right? But we'll get through it. We're halfway done at least, right? So, all right, so what's the next step here, right? So in step 6, there's actually two things here, both of which are not obvious, so we'll go through this carefully. Right, and on the right, can I switch these around? Yep, I'm going to put the positive in front. So b squared over 4a squared minus c over a. Right, same thing. Right? If I have negative 2 plus 8, that's the same as 8 plus negative 2, right? Or 8 minus 2. Okay, just making sure we're allowed to do that. All right, so part of step 6 is to simplify this thing here on the right. How do I simplify it? Well, right now we're subtracting two fractions, right? So how do you add or subtract fractions? Well, you can't if the denominators are not equal, right? So unless the denominators are exactly the same, we can't do it. So we get the least common denominator, which we might as well just use the 4a squared. So if the least common denominator is 4a squared, how do I turn this into 4a squared? Well, it already is. However, this is only an a. Right? So what am I missing? Well, I'm missing a 4. And if I want a squared, I'm missing another a, right? Because a times a is a squared. Okay, well, from that, we get... here, I'm going to keep going to the right here, if that's okay. So now we have b squared over 4a squared minus, so c times 4 times a is also 4 times a times c, divided by 4a squared, right? Remember, a times a is a squared, 4a squared. And now that we have the same denominator, the 4a squared is in the denominator, now we just subtract the numerators, b squared minus 4ac. Aha, that's looking a little familiar, right? That's the part of the quadratic formula, right? But we're not done, right? So that's one thing. That's the right side here. So this is equal to b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 4a squared, right? It's not 2a, not just yet. Right. So also part of step 6 is to factor all of this. And right, you must think I'm crazy. How can we factor this when these aren't numbers, right? The b and the a and the b, I mean, that's crazy, right? But remember, these factor as perfect square trinomials. So this is going to be a perfect square trinomial. It's going to look like this, right? A squared plus 2ab plus b squared. And in that form, we can factor it as a plus b squared. Now, I'm using capital letters here because the capital A is not the same as little a. In fact, the capital A is really just x here, right? Because it's x squared. And we have the 2. Now, what's the a here? It's not this number. It's this number cut in half, right? It's b over 2a. And that will cancel the 2's here. And then b... oh no, I'm sorry, a is x. Yeah, this will be b here. All right, so a is x, capital B is b over 2a. I think that works, right? So this should be b over 2a quantity squared. And I know I'm kind of running out of space here, but this should work, right? This is x squared plus, right, this 2 cancels with this 2, and you just get b over a times x. plus b over 2a, well, when you square it, you just get b squared over 4a squared, right? I mean, that's how we got it up here, right? These are the same. Okay? Right? So what is capital A plus capital B squared? So capital A is just x, right? Capital B, right? This is, again, 2a capital B. Capital B is little b over 2a, right? And then the whole thing is squared, right? That's the square here. All right. Well, there we go. We factored this, right, as a perfect square trinomial. Here it is again. Let me just clean it up a little bit. This is x plus b over 2a, which is just some number. The whole thing squared. And then on the right, we have this number, b squared minus 4ac, all over 4a squared. Okay, so now we're almost done. Step 7 is to get rid of the square here, right? Use the square root method. Take the square root of both sides. So square root on the left, square root on the right, but don't forget the plus or minus. So on the left, we just get x plus b over 2a, right? Without the square root, they cancel out, right? Well, in some sense, they cancel each other out, right? And then on the right, we get plus or minus. Now notice this is a square root of a fraction, and just to remind you, if you take the square root of, u over w, you can just take the square root of u over the square root of w, right? They can split up like that. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take the square root of the numerator and then divided by the square root of the denominator. Okay. Well, look at the denominator, right? The square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of a squared is a. Well, absolute value of a, but we're assuming, well, I guess we're assuming a is positive, but it works out either way. So don't worry about that, right? So the square root of 4a squared is just 2a. Now, what about the numerator here? So we still have the plus or minus, right? Yeah, be careful. You can't split this up, right? We talked about this back in chapter 10. This is a very common mistake. People love to do, square root of u plus v, although it's a minus here, right? So the square root of u minus v, right? Yeah, this is not the square root of u minus the square root of v. You cannot split them up like that. When you're adding or subtracting, this never works. When you're multiplying or dividing, of course it works. It works all the time. We just did it here, right? But yeah, this does not work here, right? So the numerator here, believe it or not, just leave it alone. And in fact, this looks pretty familiar at this point, right? Square root of b squared minus 4ac, all over 2a, right? So the last step, step 8, we have x, well, yeah, that's our goal, to get x equals. But, yep, all we have to do now is subtract the b over 2a from both sides. I'm just copying all this down here. Okay, yep, so the only thing left to do is to subtract b over 2a. And instead of putting it over here, right, remember, typically you want to put it in front of the square root. So I'm going to put the negative b over 2a in front. And this just cancels out. This adds up to 0, right? So we're done. X equals, well, notice we have a common denominator of 2a. So we can combine those as a single fraction now, where the numerator is just negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Well, this is none other than the quadratic formula, right? So we just derived the quadratic formula from scratch, right? From nothing, well, not from nothing, but from originally we had this quadratic equation, and we wanted to solve it for x by completing the square. And we did that, right? I understand that it's a horrendous process here. This is not easy to follow, but that's what you get, right? You get the quadratic formula from completing the square. So that's why we did completing the square before we did the quadratic formula. This follows from completing the square. If we didn't have completing the square, you're not gonna just guess the quadratic formula, right? That would be crazy if you just happen to guess it right. So this is how to figure it out, and it's not easy, right? The good news is that you don't have to do this ever again, right? You know the process of completing the square, and you know the quadratic formula, or if you don't, you will know it soon. You will be able to remember this very quickly. You just have to spend a little time memorizing the quadratic formula. Because look, what's your alternative? If you forget the quadratic formula, well, guess what? You got to do all this. You got to do all this again, and I don't think you want to do that again. Right? You probably didn't want to do this in the first place. But I did want to show you where this quadratic formula came from. It doesn't come from thin air, right? It comes from this rather tedious process. Okay? So yeah, if you didn't follow any of this, then don't worry about it. You're not going to have to do this, right? You do have to complete the square in a specific example where we give you, say, x squared minus 8x plus 10 or something like that equals 0. But not for general a, b, and c like we did here. Okay, so yeah, the quadratic formula just comes from completing the square on this. And so I hope that helps. At least you have some appreciation now of where the quadratic formula comes from. Right, it wasn't just a lucky guess. So yeah, like I say, in this video here, if you didn't follow that, any of this, don't worry about it. Just make sure you know the quadratic formula. This is the key result here. If you know this, then you can solve any quadratic equation. Okay, so that's it for chapter 11. So we did 11.1 and 11.2. So I hope this helps.